So in terms of fleshing out certain positions that needed to be filled, right? Let's take a look at this preseason roster, right? So several players across, different lines here. Let's start with the goalkeepers. Kaylee Collins, Erin McLeod, and Anna Morehouse listed as goalkeepers for Orlando Pride in preseason. Defenders, 9 total. Carrie Abello, Kaylin Cosme, Cecilia Jimenez Delgado, Carrie Lawrence, Megan Montefusco, Courtney Peterson, Tony Presley, Kylie Strum, and Amy Turner. Midfielders with 9, Michaela Clough, Maggie Doherty Howard, Unger James, Gunny Johnsdaughter, Thay Rice, Parker Roberts, Erica Timrack, Viviana Villacorta, Chelsea Washington. And then for the forward core, rounding out with 8 players, and Julie Doyle, Darian Jenkins, Abby Kim, Sydney Larue, Leah Pruitt, Jessie Scarpa, Jada Talley, and Marta, the Brazilian legend. So, I mean, looking at this roster, this preseason roster, knowing that there are going to eventually be cuts, right, as the preseason continues to go on ahead of the Challenge Cup, I think there are players that we can go through in this roster, despite so many of the departures, right, and new faces that are being introduced to the club. And there's a number of players that you can go through and say, this is probably going to be a starting 11 caliber player that we see on opening day. And when we're going through this roster, even just looking in the short term, just looking at 2021, the season we just came off of, right? There are several players that you can point to and say, this was someone who played a role in 2021. This is another player who played a role in 2021. And I think when we're looking from the top down, players who stand out there, it's a Sydney Larue, right? These are 2 players in the attacking core that you would assume are probably going to be locks for a starting 11 should preseason go well and everybody remains healthy. And then even when you get into the midfield core, where there's probably some questions there, a player like Gunny Johnsdaughter, Erica Timrack, right? Doherty Howard, who they also acquired in a trade ahead of 2021. Players who ended up seeing time on the pitch. And you could do the same thing with defenders as well when we're looking at someone like a Courtney Peterson, right? So there's players that you can go through in this roster and maybe kind of put a pin on it and say, this is someone that we're likely going to see in a starting 11. But in terms of breaking down,
even Amy Turner, I know running through that list, she's another one that saw a lot of time last year in 2021. We could see her slotting into that back line, an international player that really needs to step up, losing Allie Krieger and Allie Riley.
Yeah, when we're talking about this roster coming off of some of those big departures, I mean, it's like we can look and circle like this was someone who was a part of starting lineups in 2021. But there's, similarly to some other rosters across the league right now, there are opportunities here across all the lines, right, for Orlando Pride, for a number of these players to probably really get in there into preseason and compete and show Amanda Cromwell, the coaching staff, that they want to compete for a spot in that starting 11. And I think a good way to maybe break this down, in that we're talking about the roster, we're talking about perhaps an ideal starting 11, but breaking this down into maybe some other areas to watch, right? When we're looking at young prospects to watch for Orlando Pride, I'm excited for this club. They have also been showing a bit of excitement in saying, hey, announcing that they are signing their young prospects to contracts, right, ahead of, or going into this preseason. And someone I'm really excited about for this team and that I want to keep an eye on is Viviana Villacorta. This is a player that they actually drafted out of the 2021 draft, right, who is just now going to be able to participate in a full preseason ahead of a full season with her NWSL club, right? So during that 2021 draft, where there was a bit of a pandemic clause, right, where then there for players who were declaring, they could declare for the draft or opt back into playing their final senior seasons with their collegiate teams. And while the most recent draft is probably freshest in everyone's mind, and then somebody like a player and Mia Official getting drafted and making headlines about opting to play for Tigres, there was that storyline about the connection between UCLA and Cromwell and what they're building in Orlando Pride. So when I'm looking for young prospects to have an impact and this Orlando Pride team, it's absolutely
Mhm.
Villa Corta for me, because this is another one of those players that you can point to and say there's that connection in terms of a player at the collegiate level already having a relationship with the coaching staff in place in Orlando. This is like a mutual relationship here where the player knows what the coaching staff is probably going to expect from them, and vice versa. The coaching staff knows that this is the type of player that they can ask X, Y, or Z from, and sort of see them execute that out on the pitch. Now, she's coming off of an ACL injury, so
Yeah.
I'm very eager to see what she looks like sort of post rehab and recovery. But she's absolutely my young prospect to keep an eye on ahead
I
of it.
think she's a really good one to keep an eye on, because there's also not like a box that she is trying to fit in, right? There's no real super high expectations for this club, which I think as a young player helps you with that advantage, because you can come in and do anything. And if you contribute and if you help, that's great. So ceiling's really, really high for a young player like that. When you look at the experienced side of things, are some experienced players on this roster, whether they're coming in from a different team or they've been there. And I think one of them that we definitely have to highlight is Gunny Jonsdottir. She is a midfielder player, the Icelandic international. She came at the start of the 2021 season, right before the NWSL championship. So she had the NWSL Challenge Cup, which Orlando did not compete in. But she came in and to this club, and she was able to play games and be a contributor for Mark Skinner. And then as the coaching change happened in the middle of the year for 2021, and Becky Burleigh stepped in as the interim head coach, Jonsdottir was a consistent factor, and she was one of the most consistent players. She's older. She has a lot of experience, and 33 years old, but she appeared in every single regular season game, which is super impressive for her. And she was such a consistent factor. So her experience taking the team last year through every single match and through the ups and downs that Orlando had with players rotating in throughout the Olympics during the summer, she's remained that constant factor. Can she step up her game just a little bit more? Be that experienced player that controls the midfield, that can bridge the gaps between younger players in Viviana Villacorta and some of the more veteran players in Sydney Larue and Marta. Gunny Jonsdottir is a midfielder and a player for Orlando that has the experience that can hopefully lean into that and also help Amanda Cromwell, because remember, head coach for the Pride, Amanda Cromwell, this is her first professional season, which changes things. It does. It's a different game. These players only have to focus on their sport. They no longer have class to run to or different social activities that are happening in college. It's just a different beast overall. And we saw that with Becky Burleigh, who was the University of Florida coach for years. She stepped in to coach halfway through the Orlando season. Her biggest change was these are professional and they're women. They show up to practice every day and they want to get better. They know what it's like to train. So I think if Jonsdottir can be that bridge, be that consistent player, it could be a really, really big year for Gunny Jonsdottir.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I think in a offseason that saw, yes, a lot of departures, but a lot of those departures be more experienced or veteran level type of players, I think was also very significant. So a team like Orlando Pride that is welcoming a lot of new faces into the fold, not just on the player side, but also like really in the administrative level and the coaching side of things, there are going to be moments and stretches throughout a long season where you really do lean into and rely on those veteran and experienced players. And I absolutely am in agreement that Jonsdottir is going to be one of those players. I mean, she was nearly a player of that caliber last year. She was somebody who was absolutely in the mix of almost competing for an Iron Woman title with Orlando Pride, playing in that midfield week in and week out and down the stretch as the Pride sort of kind of fell out of contention there, kind of getting limited minutes. So I think that's going to ring louder this year in terms of her position in the midfield and for this team in regards to leadership. But in terms of looking at this team and this sort of rebuild that we're looking at for them, we're also going to be looking for players who are going to try to take that next step.
Mm-hmm.
Players that we want to see take it to the next level. And I think when we're looking at this sort of category of player, I'm keeping my eye on Courtney Peterson for this one. This is a young defender for Orlando Pride who joined the team fairly recently. I think when we're, talking about it, you're talking about joining up with the team in a really tough time in 2020, was only able to get limited minutes, right? Because when we remember 2020, it consisted of, the height of the pandemic, the inaugural Challenge Cup, right? Which Orlando unfortunately was unable to participate in and really only be able to get in a little bit of fall series. And so getting a real look at Courtney Peterson and who she is and what she can bring to Orlando Pride during this 2021 season was very impressive. So as a player entering her third year in the league, I think that we're going to keep an eye on a player like this to sort of keep that pace going, right? Keep that development going. And now she's going to be doing this alongside a new coaching staff, right? Versus the old coaching staff with Mark Skinner and company who brought her into the fold. So I'm looking for Courtney Peterson to continue her development and take that next step to the next level with Orlando Pride. In terms of an international spotlight, it's a big international year. We're looking at players who are very impactful for their teams, who could possibly be missing some time due to international windows in light of World Cup qualifiers and such. And I think a big one that we're looking at, of course, is somebody like Marta, a player who has very quickly become real. We're talking about faces of this franchise, right? Sort of became an additional face of the franchise. An icon of the game, right? It goes without saying. And I think even with all of sort of the narrative around who the Orlando Pride are going to be on the pitch in 2022, when you have somebody like Marta on your roster, you maybe look at the roster a little bit differently. You're like, oh, okay, well, you got a legend on your team. So really, how is this going to possibly look? But, in terms of CONMEBOL, in terms of Copa America, qualifiers coming into play, you're talking about a stretch of summertime, right? Peak summertime matches that somebody like a Marta could be missing. And then maybe I'm also even looking at Gunny Johnsaughter as well for this category. Someone who's going to potentially be participating in UEFA qualifiers, and those are coming up very soon, right? In February, but they go and stretch as late into October of this year. So again, a couple of players here who are impactful for the Pride on the pitch for club, but also equally as impactful for their teams on the national team level as well. So there's maybe a moment where we can't necessarily nail down a starting 11, but I like that we've got a handful of players that we can sort of maybe highlight and chat a little bit about in terms of the season to come